Hi and welcome. We're now in sociology, looking at the first part of chapter on culture. So consider this for a moment. Perhaps you have a ritual or a superstition when you perform before a game. Maybe you play hockey or basketball or baseball. Maybe you've got to put your left shoe on first and then your right. Or if you're taping your hockey stick, you always make 6 wraps with the tape. So, or maybe if you are writing a test on today, for example, perhaps you eat a particular breakfast, or you say some sort of pre-test ritual mantra that helps prepare yourself. Now this can include, things like when we cross ourselves for religious purpose. This can include a quick prayer that we might say and before certain things. All sorts of people in all sorts of circumstances engage in rituals basically to reduce stress and to focus. Now, like how these rituals and superstitions can contribute to how we feel prepared or in control, culture offers tools to help people to solve problems easier, like what crops to plant, how to build a house. Religion helps people to give meaning to their lives and to come to terms with death. Unlike superstitions, though, which are created by individuals, many cultural norms are widely shared. What we eat, how we are raised, and how we'll raise our own children, if, when, or whom we marry, how we make our money, and what we read. These are all parts of our culture, if you will, that there have been influences on us that influence who we choose to marry, how we raise our kids. Even people who are themselves on their very individualized still conform to most cultural rules. That can include things like, just because I wear shorts in the winter and don't meet that particular norm particularly well doesn't mean that I drive on the left side of the road. I adhere to most other cultural rules, as most of us do, but we still have some degree of individuality. Now, culture refers to the knowledge, language, values, customs, and material objects that are passed from one person to another, from one generation to the next. And that's a big chunk. So think of that. The knowledge that we have as Canadians about what it is to be in this world today, and the people, the language. Well, our language is certainly different than people from other parts of the world. Spain, China. However, what we understand through language is understood through experience and exposure to one another. The customs that we have, how we have a custom of how we marry, our celebrations at Christmas, anniversaries, birthdays are unique across the world in some cases. So as the world grows smaller, and cultural acceptance and tolerance for the views as well as culture of others becomes increasingly important for our own collective well-being. So for the next 2 weeks, we're going to explore culture is how and what influences culture over time or over geography. You imagine that, we're all Canadians across Canada, but do we all speak the English language the same? Do we have accents? Do we have unique expressions that are unique to our geographic area? Well, if you traveled out to the East Coast, you know that they have a certain way of seeing the world and the way that they share and talk to people, and the geography influences their customs. It influences, where they are geopolitically. It influences the way that they express things compared to Ontario, compared to the West Coast. So we're going to look at that. And then in week 3, we're going to look at components of culture. And in week 4, we'll look at the role of technology, cultural change over time, and diversity. So we're going to explore sociological analysis of culture and culture in the future. we're going to begin with in this week is components. So let's first define culture. I sort of already did. So remember, society is a large social grouping that occupies the same geographic territory. So we have a society in Ontario. We also have Society of Canada. And we have a Society of Owen Sound that we are considered, because we are a large social group. We occupy the same geographic territory, and it's subject to the same political authority and dominant cultural expectations. And that's where it can vary from province to province a wee bit about cultural expectations. We abide by the same guidelines and norms, however, how we express them can be different. Like as in Quebec, there's a large French-speaking population in Quebec, but they're still Canadians. So when we think in terms of culture, so beyond instinct and biological drives, culture is a learned phenomenon, and that's an important variable. There's nothing culturally, genetically endowed in us. You know, if I was born in another country by my same parents, let's say they gave birth to me in Japan, I would have as much ability to learn the language, the customs, and the cultural norms of Japan as I was to learning Canada. So another definition, the common denominator that makes actions of individuals intelligible to the group. So that's an important part. We're learning, and the common denominator that makes what we do, the actions of us, understandable to the larger group. So when I reach my hand out to somebody here in Canada, it's clearly understood that I'm greeting them or I'm shaking their hand. That's an action that is understood by a larger group here in Canadian society, and for that matter, North America and a lot of Europe. But it's not the only way that people of the same culture greet each other. So we're a combination of biology and nature, the social environment. The biology expresses who we are individually. The culture will influence how those expressions get interpreted. Culture is knowledge, language, values, and customs, and the material objects that are passed from one person to the next, from one generation to the next. And so that's important. How we understand about family is passed on by the family we were raised by. So shelter, that is a universal type of material culture. And we're going to break down what material culture is versus non-material culture. But you can imagine, material culture are those things that we can touch and feel. So shelter is a universal type of material culture, but it comes in a wide variety of shapes and forms. If you look across the world at different cultures, what people classify as an appropriate, culturally normative home will look different across the world. Just because you're used to being raised and seeing bungalows doesn't mean bungalows are universal across the world. We might, what might for some of the reasons be for the similarities and the differences that you see across cultural examples, well, that's an interesting question. What makes for those differences? So what we're going to begin with is material culture. And material culture is all the physical or tangible creations that members of a society make, use, and share. Now that's that's your houses, that's the businesses that we operate and what we shop at, the malls, that's all the material things. So the things that we make, use, and share. All right? So technology is at the root of a lot of this. Technology is what sociologists indicate it makes use of the raw materials that exist in a particular geographic area, in our case is Canada, and transforms them into useful forms. So we mill trees in order to have 2x4s to build houses. We mill trees in order to break down the pulp into paper. We mill, oil to run our vehicles. So these are the technology is what takes these raw materials and translates them into something that we can use. So by definition, technology is the knowledge, techniques, and tools that make it possible for people to transform resources into usable forms, and the knowledge and the skills required to use them after they have been developed. So just because we have the technology to build cars doesn't mean that everybody knows how to drive one. So we, through our cultural norms, establish means by which, what age can you drive at? That may not be the same across the world. You know, how we drive, what side of the road we drive, these are all part of our culture. So non-material culture, as the other direction, we have material culture we just talked about. Non-material culture are the abstract, intangible human creations of society that influence people's behavior. So what does that include? Well, that includes our language. We didn't use raw materials and technology to develop and use language. Language is non-material. The beliefs that we hold, the values, Canadians have values, Americans have values, Spanish have values, and so every culture has what they value, the thing that they rise above all other things. Rules of behavior. I will post in week 3 a video by an anthropologist looking at human behavior and how we use that to communicate and how that's different across cultures. So rules for behavior, the way we greet, for example, is not the same. We do a handshake, somebody else does a kiss on one cheek, another group does kisses on both cheeks, another group does 3 kisses on alternate cheeks. So gender rules, what it is to be male and masculine and what it is to be female and feminine is non-material because it's culturally defined. The laws, family patterns and marriages, political systems, whether a Democrat or dictator, democratic that is, or dictator, faith, religion, non-religious, or other systems. So when we look at culture, we must still remember material and non-material. Now, there's also what we know as cultural universals. And cultural universals exist in all cultures, that's why they're universal, and are made up of people such as, these cultures are made up of people, and this was the work done by George Murdoch many years ago, and he basically sort of determined there were about 70 universals. There were customs and practice that occur across all societies, and some of them are related to appearance, that is to say, what we choose to wear is a universal, but what we wear and what that looks like in different cultures can be variable, but we all choose to adorn ourselves with something that separates us from others or that is a desired. Social institutions, there's a universal. All cultures have families. That's a social institution. Economy, cultures have an economy. Now, not all of them exchange the same money and at the same rate, and that is not the only thing that cultures will trade. So the customs and other cultural components, how the process of getting married and starting a family may vary, and that custom of marriage will vary. So although there are some cultural universals, there are 4 common non-material cultural components, and I'll run through them one at a time. And this is what makes up the components of culture. Symbols is number 1. Now, symbols are anything that are meaningful, that meaningfully represent something else. Symbols can function to produce loyalty and animosity, love or hate, and they can also help us communicate. So when you think in terms of symbols, the flag is a symbol. The Canadian flag symbolizes what it is to be Canadian. That's what it represents, at least to Canadians. A heart, that represents love. It's a symbol that represents something else. When someone hands you a heart on Valentine's Day, you know what that kind of means. You understand the meaning of that symbol. The dove, for peace. The Nazi swastika represents hate for many people. It may also have other representations. When we're driving and we hear a siren and see flashing lights, those symbols let us know we should signal and pull over to the side and let the emergency vehicle pass. We all are familiar with the raised middle finger as being a symbol of anger or hostility. We don't greet each other with that and recognize it as a greeting. We recognize it as a response to something that somebody did that we want to acknowledge we are angry about or hostile. We look at the symbols that we associate with male and female, oftentimes pink and blue. And that's not the limit, of course, but it's an example of symbols meaning other things. Now, there's a key. The key here is that there may be one symbol, but it's interpreted differently by various cultures. You know, the signals that we might for thumbs up or okay or any number of symbols may not be interpreted by all cultures in exactly the same way. And so something that you might take for granted as a normal gesture in your culture may not be understood and received in the same manner in another culture. Now, media, commercials, clothing, cosmetics, medications depict who their market is and what it is to be considered desirable. So oftentimes we see these examples in commercials that let us know what's desirable, what's good, what's bad. This is somewhat based on values, and it's helping shape belief. That's why sometimes the issue you will hear around commercials and marketers is that they're marketing to children. Well, they're doing so in order to establish, if you will, a regular view and a regular expectation of what's desirable. So when they become older and consumers themselves, they'll continue to purchase something that they've learned this is what's expected. It may not be desirable. It may not be okay. You know, the current issue of vaping products and being flavored in flavors that children will enjoy, the recognition that this might start to produce a younger population vaping is the risk. So when we look at the kinds of things, symbols, how we market in commercials can be symbolic in terms of what is it they're trying to say, what is desirable, what is it that they're telling me I should want. So symbols are powerful tools, and they are powerful components of culture and how we recognize what is our culture. Secondly, language is the second component. Now, language is a set of symbols, verbal and nonverbal. When we look at language, it's both what we say with our voice and tone of voice, but it's also the nonverbal. As you notice, when I talk, I use my hands a bit, my face expresses. Those are all nonverbal components that augment the language and the message that I'm trying to communicate. So language is a set of symbols that express ideas and enable people to think and communicate with one another. So language is learned, clearly. We learn it from early on, and we practice it, and we go to school, and we learn about the symbols of A, B, C, and D, and putting them together to create words, and putting words together to communicate sentences, and to communicate ideas that we can share with one another. The sharing of stories provides a social reality. Now, you might want to check in your textbook about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that's in your textbook. Now, not only do we have a shared reality, we have a shared past with the use of language. With my family, I can talk about Christmas from 1963. We can talk about the history of Canadian culture, but we can also plan for the future through our use of communication. Language and race and ethnicity and language diversity in Canada, you'll find those elements in your textbook. Please review them. Like I mentioned, I will be posting a video in week 3 looking at body language. And it really sort of emphasizes the role of communication across cultures. The third element, values. Now, I've touched on this. Values are collective ideas about what is right or wrong, good or bad, desirable or undesirable in a particular culture. So, for example, we might value good health or intelligence or knowledge or freedom as values, but they're not necessarily universally held across all cultures. Other cultures will have different values based on where they are geographically, how they have emerged over time as a culture. What role does religion play in a culture? What role does family play? Political positions, economics, healthcare, education. These all shape what we value. So in Canada, some commonly held values that hold society together as well as set them apart. Now in Canada, the similarity and differences between Quebec, Newfoundland, Alberta and such, there's a lot of similarities, and of course there are also some differences, but we share similar values. Now elements of values are criteria by which we evaluate others, objects, and events. And we do this frequently. I mean, many of your decisions that you make relative to this is what I believe, or your beliefs, as we'll see, are based on your values. And a lot of times we're not really cognitively aware of our values. We don't think about what we value. But when we make decisions about yes or no, good or bad, we are making value judgments. So whether that's about this is a good person, that's a bad person, you might want to wonder about what value am I hinging those decisions on? Okay? So they are often in pairs, as I've mentioned. In terms of office, it's good and bad, brave, cowardly, hardworking, lazy. Values are very general orientations. Now consider what are Canadian core values. And these core values have been determined over lots of consultations with a lot of citizens about what's important in Canada. So here's a list of some that have been considered important values in Canadian society. They believe, or we believe, in consultation and dialogue, accommodation and tolerance, support for diversity, compassion and generosity, and we celebrate and value Canada's natural beauty. Now, Canada's world image is around commitment to freedom, peace, and nonviolent change. Now, there may be, of course, other views of how Canada participates in the world. We are looking at things from our perspective about what our intended message is. We might not always be communicating that as effectively as we think. Now, we've looked at symbols, language, values. The fourth is norms. Norms are the established set of rules of behavior or standards of conduct. Norms encourage predictability, stability, and organization in a society. Now we'll touch on, as we did when we looked at the theories, structural functionalism, for example, is one that sort of argues that society is generally very stable and it doesn't change rapidly. And so norms would be one of the elements that functionalists look to that establish this continuity, this consistency, is that we do have these norms, these rules of behavior. This includes, and I would suggest you might try this out, do a little test to see what is a norm and what is not a norm. I'm wearing shorts in the wintertime. I get lots of feedback from people asking me if I'm okay, if I'm crazy, or do I know it's cold. This is feedback that I get from society, that they're aware that I'm breaching a social norm, and aren't I aware that there's a social norm and I should be wearing long pants? But it's not such a serious breach that I go to jail or I'm somehow punished. It's just something that falls on that fine line. I think what we'll get into is that it falls on the line of what we would consider a folkway, and we'll get into that. So when we look in terms of norms, marriage is something that is valued in Canadian society, and norms will tell us how to be a good husband and a good wife. Non-smoking is valued for good health and politeness, if you will. The norm would be where to smoke and smoking etiquette. That if norms help us understand. And what I can remember back when I was younger, smoking was done everywhere. I mean, you could smoke in people's houses. You smoke in a restaurant. But I have also seen that norm shift where there's a stronger movement towards, if you're going to smoke in the area that doesn't affect everybody the same way. I mean, I can remember being in restaurants and finding my food tasting different because people around me were smoking in a restaurant when I was a child. We don't find that to happen anymore, and that's because the norm has changed. So they're not stable insofar as they don't ever change, but they can change, and they can change relatively quickly, and within one's lifetime is considered relatively quickly. Norms can be formal, which are written down as laws. So we have norms that are like laws. Norms can also be informal. They're unwritten standards of behavior understood by people who share a common identity. Now there are things that are known as sanctions, and sanctions are rewards for appropriate behavior and punishment for inappropriate behavior. Consider insurance. Insurance companies will often reward you for safe driving over a certain amount of time. You might get a lower rate. Whereas if you continue to breach the law, you may find your car insurance is stopped. You have to find someone else to get insurance from, or you may not get insurance. So there are sanctions that are built in throughout our norms. Norms can be described in form of folkways, mores, and laws, and we're going to break these down individually. Folkways are informal norms or everyday customs that may be violated without a serious consequence within a particular culture. So for example, brushing teeth, kinds of clothing that we wear. My wearing shorts in the winter, people, they often tell me it's cold and shouldn't I put pants on, or are you crazy? Gestures, how we communicate using gestures are folkways. When I mention teeth brushing, it's not a law that you must brush your teeth, and if you didn't brush your teeth for 4 or 5 days, others might comment about your breath. And so you haven't followed the norm. Get into the bathroom and brush your teeth. But there's no serious consequence. It's not a written law. Gestures, religious fastings, kinds of cars we buy, whether that's all related to folkways. They're not laws. They're informal rules or guidelines. Now, mores, M-O-R-E-S, are more strongly held norms. And they have a moral or an ethical connotation that may or may not be violated without serious consequences in a particular culture. So these have more of there aren't laws, but there are stronger held beliefs about, no, you don't cross that ethical line, cheating on an exam. If you get away with it and someone finds out, they might really change how they view you. That's a mores. Now, sexual morality issues are known as taboos. Now, taboos could have a legal connotation. Incest, for example, is a taboo, and it also has a legal component to it. And that's where the third part comes, and that's laws. Now, laws are formal, standardized norms that have been enacted by legislation and are enforced by formal sanctions. Now, laws are helpful. It's helpful that there's a law that says when you get up in the morning and drive to work, you drive on the right-hand side of the road. I'm glad for that law. I'm glad that everybody abides by that law. It makes it safe for us to go to work. There's laws that protect us in our lives. There's laws that protect us in the way we interact with one another and the things that we have permission to do or not permission to do. Okay. This just gives you an overview of how these components of culture are related to each other. Now, values are drivers of norms. Folkways, mores, and laws are forms of norms, and taboos are the extreme forms of mores. Now, this is not the end of culture. We'll do a part 2, and in that part 2, we'll look at the role of technology and the larger scope of culture. All right, everybody. Keep up the good work.